Northern France, late summer of 1944. The countryside is quiet now, but in the memory of the men who fought here, it never was. A German convoy moves cautiously along a narrow road lined with hedgerows. The air smells of diesel and dust. The engines rumble low. Somewhere above, a faint hum begins to grow. The men look up. At first, it is distant, almost uncertain. Then the unmistakable snarl of aircraft engines fills the valley. Jabos, someone shouts. Fighter bombers. But what follows is not the thunder of bombs or the whistle of rockets. It is a sound far more precise, more surgical. A tearing, metallic roar that seems to split the sky itself. The American 50 caliber machine guns have begun to speak. Streams of tracers rake across the convoy. The first rounds rip through the lead truck's windshield, shattering glass and flesh in the same instant. Armor-piercing incendiaries punch clean through steel engine blocks, igniting fuel in orange flashes that turn to firestorms. Within seconds, the road becomes a corridor of flame. The pilots never drop a bomb, they don't have to. The 50s do everything. German soldiers scatter, diving for ditches, some firing wildly into the sky. The bullets come so fast the air itself feels solid, vibrating under a rhythm no man can match. When the aircraft passes, silence does not return. Only the crackle of burning fuel and the groan of twisted metal. For those who survive, one truth becomes painfully clear. It wasn't just a machine gun, it was a force of nature. From that day on, wherever the 50 caliber appeared, mounted on bombers, on tanks, on jeeps, the reaction was always the same. German troops learned to recognize the sound instantly. A deep, chattering thunder that meant no cover was safe. It could shred the fuselage of a Messerschmitt, tear open an armored car, slice through tree trunks, sandbags, and even concrete walls. It was, as many German soldiers later wrote in their diaries, the smallest cannon that could end a life before you heard the shot. The narrator's voice lowers. By the time the Allies reached the heart of Europe, one weapon, simple, reliable, and brutally efficient, had become the symbol of American firepower. It wasn't the tank, it wasn't the rifle. It was John Browning's 50 caliber machine gun, the M2. A weapon so feared, so respected, that even the enemy admitted its supremacy. This is the story of that weapon. The gun the Germans hated. The gun they could never match. The gun that ruled the skies and the roads of Europe. This is the story of why German soldiers feared the American 50 caliber. The story begins not on the battlefield, but in a quiet workshop in Ogden, Utah. It is 1918. John Moses Browning, a man already considered the greatest gun designer alive, studies a captured German machine gun laid across his workbench. The Great War is ending, but its lessons are not forgotten. Browning's eyes follow the contours of the Maxim gun, the weapon that had defined industrial warfare. Its mechanism is brilliant, but its caliber, too small, too light, no longer fits the future he imagines. In Europe, soldiers had learned that armor was the new king. Armored cars, tanks, low-flying aircraft. The modern battlefield was no longer vulnerable to rifle fire. A new weapon would be needed, something that could punch through steel and yet fire fast enough to fill the sky with lead. The U.S. Army came to Browning with a simple request: build a machine gun that could stop an airplane. Browning accepted the challenge. Working from his already proven M1917 design, he enlarged everything: the chamber, the receiver, the barrel, until it could fire a new, massive cartridge. The 50 Browning machine gun round. Each bullet was 5.5 inches long and weighed nearly 2 ounces. When fired, it carried more than 13,000 joules of energy, enough to tear through an engine block, pierce light armor, or reach out a mile and still kill. In early tests, the weapon roared like thunder. The first prototypes spat brass across the test range, punching holes through quarter-inch steel plates as if they were paper. The Army observers were stunned. Nothing like it existed anywhere in the world. By 1921, the gun was officially adopted as the Browning machine gun, caliber 50 M1921. It was heavy, unwieldy, and almost absurdly powerful, a weapon ahead of its time. Few understood then that it would outlive every man in that room. When Browning died suddenly in 1926, the weapon was still in refinement. His son, Val Browning, carried on the work, improving the feed system and barrel cooling. By 1933, the final version appeared, the M2, a design so perfect it would remain almost unchanged for the next 90 years. As the 1930s darkened toward war, the United States quietly armed its planes, ships, and vehicles with this new weapon. Few realized how decisive that choice would become. While Europe obsessed over ever larger cannons and complex automatic guns, American doctrine settled on simplicity. One gun, one caliber, everywhere. Infantry would use it to break fortifications. Tanks would mount it for anti-air defense. Aircraft would bristle with them. 6, 8, even 12 at a time. When war came, the Allies would carry a weapon born of one man's intuition. That reliability and raw kinetic energy would matter more than mechanical sophistication. The first to discover how right he was would not be American soldiers, but the men they fought against. The narrator's tone deepens. In North Africa, in Sicily, in the skies over France, the Germans began to encounter the 50 for the first time. They were trained to fear artillery, mortars, and bombs. But this was different. This was precise destruction, arriving faster than the human mind could react. For the first time in modern warfare, a single weapon could kill men, vehicles, and aircraft with equal ease. And it was everywhere. Mounted on jeeps, fixed on tanks, hanging from the wings of Thunderbolts and Mustangs. The weapon that John Browning had designed at the twilight of one world war had become the beating heart of another. And soon, the men who faced it would give it a name of their own, a name whispered in every trench and field report. They called it simply Der 50er, the 50. North Africa, 1942. The heat shimmers above the desert sand. A column of German trucks and half-tracks moves cautiously through the open plains of Tunisia, dust trailing behind them like ghosts. They have grown used to the sight of British fighters sweeping overhead, their light machine guns doing little more than scratch paint and shatter windshields. But this time, something different comes out of the sun. The roar of twin engines breaks across the desert. Two American P-40 Warhawks dive low, their wings glittering in the harsh light. Before anyone on the ground can react, the air erupts with sound. Not the light chatter of rifle-caliber guns, but a deep, rolling thunder. 50 caliber fire. The rounds strike like invisible hammers. Engines explode. Tires disintegrate. The sand itself leaps into the air, shredded by the storm of lead. When the planes pull up, only wreckage remains. German survivors describe the experience in one word: unbelievable. They had fought British aircraft armed with .303 caliber Brownings and Italian planes with 12.7mm Breda machine guns. Both were dangerous, but survivable. The American 50, by contrast, left nothing to survive. Reports filtered back through the Africa Corps headquarters. Vehicle crews wrote of convoys torn apart by machine gun fire that pierced the trucks like paper. Tank commanders noted that even armored half-tracks could be crippled with a few well-placed bursts. One report from the 21st Panzer Division referred to it bluntly. These are not machine guns, they are small cannons. The impact on morale was immediate. Crews began covering their vehicles with improvised armor, sandbags, spare tracks, even logs, anything to stop the incoming fire. None of it worked. The 50 punched straight through. What shocked them most was the range. German MG-34s and MG-42s were lethal within a few hundred meters. The 50 could kill beyond a kilometer accurately, with every fifth round a tracer that guided the stream of bullets like a laser. To men on the receiving end, it felt supernatural. Death arriving from a distance they could barely see. When the Allies invaded Sicily in July 1943, the weapon followed them. Every American vehicle carried one. Every aircraft bristled with them. Every encounter left new testimony of their effect. German soldiers noted how the distinctive rhythm of the M2 could be heard long before the planes appeared. Unlike their own machine guns, which had a high-pitched mechanical scream, the 50 spoke in heavy, deliberate beats. Thump, 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 each burst followed by the crack of impact. It was not just sound. It was psychology. Troops learned to recognize it, to dive for cover the moment they heard it. Luftwaffe pilots soon discovered the same fear from above. In the skies over Italy, the P-47 Thunderbolt entered the war. Heavily armored, fast, and armed with 8 M2s, it could pour more than 100 rounds per second into a target. One strafing pass could rip open a train, destroy an entire convoy, or scatter a company of infantry across open ground. Luftwaffe reports from 1943 describe the Thunderbolt as the most dangerous opponent for ground forces. The phrase repeated across captured documents: the Americans attack with cannons, not with machine guns. German mechanics studying wrecked vehicles after such attacks found gaping holes the size of fists in steel plating. Even light tanks like the Panzer II or armored cars like the SDKFZ 222 were perforated from nose to tail. The realization came slowly, but it came. The Allies had standardized a weapon powerful enough to threaten almost everything short of a heavy tank, and they carried thousands of them. The psychological toll deepened as the war moved to Europe. In Normandy, 1944, German infantry encountered the 50 once again, this time mounted on the M4 Sherman. Every Sherman carried one above the turret for anti-air and suppressive fire. It became the voice of advancing Allied armor, that deep, unmistakable hammering echoing through the bocage fields. One German veteran from the 352nd Infantry Division remembered it clearly. We could hear it before we saw the tank. It was a heavy, deep sound, different from any other gun. When it fired, the air filled with sparks and dust. You could not lift your head. Even when the 50 didn't kill, it paralyzed. Men stayed pinned down, too afraid to move. The psychological shock, the realization that no cover short of stone or armor was safe, became its own weapon. By late 1944, German intelligence manuals included entire sections on identifying and countering the American heavy machine gun. They warned infantry that sandbags and timber offered no protection, that armored vehicles should avoid exposure to strafing runs, and that attacking aircraft armed with multiple 50s was to be avoided unless surprise can be achieved. It was a polite way of saying, don't try it, you'll die. In every theater of war, from the deserts of Africa to the forests of France, the German army encountered the same terrible pattern. The weapon was simple, accurate, indestructible, and it was everywhere. The narrator's tone tightens. The German soldiers began to understand something their generals had not. The Americans had found the perfect balance of simplicity and power. Their heavy machine gun was not a specialized weapon. It was a universal tool of destruction. It could defend a bomber, guard a convoy, or level a village. And it never jammed, never overheated, never stopped firing until its belts ran dry. To face it was to face inevitability, and that realization was far more frightening than the weapon itself. The roar of the 50 was not mystery. It was engineering. To understand why German soldiers learned to fear it, one must look at what happened between the trigger and the target. The M2 Browning was not a complicated machine. It did not rely on exotic alloys or flashy mechanisms. It used a simple, brutal logic. That logic began with the cartridge. The 50 Browning round was enormous by infantry standards. It carried mass and speed together. A single bullet weighed more than most rifle cartridges, and it left the muzzle with a velocity that turned metal into ragged edges. The kinetic energy was so high that a soft target did not simply receive a wound. It experienced violent trauma. Leather straps, canvas, flesh, thin steel, aviation fabric, light armor, engine blocks, fuel lines all failed in ways that looked surgical. The round did not need to explode to destroy. It tore, it punctured, it ignited. That terrible potential was multiplied by ammunition variety. Armor-piercing rounds punched through light plating and engine blocks. Incendiary rounds sparked fuel and hydraulic lines into flame. Tracer rounds told gunners exactly where to aim. Armor-piercing incendiary rounds combined these effects to lethal ends. Allied technicians and ordnance officers learned how to mix belts for particular jobs. Need to bring down a low-flying fighter? Load the belts with armor-piercing incendiary and tracer. Need to stop vehicles passing a choke point? Use full metal jacket and incendiary. The flexibility meant a single weapon could be tuned to 1,000 battlefield problems. Then there was the gun itself. The M2 used recoil operation. It had a heavy receiver and a barrel that did not overheat into uselessness under prolonged fire. It fed from belts that could be loaded in hundreds of rounds. It would not jam because soldiers kept it clean. It survived sand and mud because its tolerances were forgiving by design. It did not require factory-grade tools to maintain in the field. When a barrel began to feel the heat, a crewman could replace it quickly and keep firing. The system was modular and practical. Compare this to the German alternatives. The MG-42 was a marvel in its own right. It fired faster than the M2. It spat rounds with a frightening mechanical staccato that demoralized men and broke morale. But the MG-42 fired a much smaller bullet, one that could wound and kill at close range, but which lacked the range and penetration to threaten light armor and aircraft the way the 50 could. Rate of fire alone did not win the exchange. Damage per hit mattered. The MG-42 could prune a formation. The 50 could prune a formation and then open a truck engine like a walnut. On the other hand, German aircraft often carried 20mm autocannon. Those weapons fired explosive shells that detonated inside aircraft. A single 20mm shell could rip a wing or a fuel tank. In a pure air-to-air duel, 20mm weapons were effective in a way bullet fire could not match. But those guns fired fewer rounds per second. They added weight and recoil that affected aircraft performance. And they were more mechanically complex. The 50 offered a different trade. It gave aircraft and ground vehicles the ability to saturate a target with high-velocity projectiles. The effect of many heavy bullets striking the same general area was sometimes as lethal as a single explosive shell. Worse for German crews, the 50 could be mounted in numbers. A single P-47 could carry 8 of them. 8 heavy streams of fire arriving almost simultaneously could shred control surfaces, tear open engines, and set fires that even an intact armor plate could not always prevent. Range played a decisive part. The effective range of the M2 against soft targets and light armor extended well beyond standard machine gun reach. It could engage a target accurately at distances where enemy small arms were merely noise. For ground troops under attack from above, that meant the lethal zone was bigger. For armored columns, it meant that aircraft could strike from positions that reduced the defender's ability to find concealment. The 50 was not simply more powerful at point blank. It rewrote the geometry of danger. The M2's reliability amplified these ballistic advantages. It did not overheat into failure on a long strafing run. It could be synchronized into aircraft wings. It could be mounted on tanks and trucks with relative ease. It tolerated rough handling. Allied crews, often under fire, could count on the guns to run. German reports repeatedly emphasized this point. A weapon that keeps firing under stress is not merely a tool. It is a psychological weapon. Men learn quickly to trust their own guns and to fear those that do not stop. Manufacturing and logistics must be considered. The United States produced this weapon in enormous quantities. Each gun used ammunition that was standardized and mass-produced. The supply system turned ball, tracer, and armor-piercing rounds into an industrial river. Allied strategists made the 50 ubiquitous because they could. The Germans, by contrast, had decided in many cases to pursue explosive calibers and complex weapon systems that were costly to produce. Their industry, strained by blockade and attrition, could not match the numbers of heavy machine guns and belts of ammunition the Allies could field. On a battlefield where mass mattered, ubiquity trumped technical refinement. Integration into combat doctrine sealed its fate. The Americans thought in terms of combined arms. Fighters would strafe columns in coordination with ground advances. Armored units would use their mounted 50s to protect against air attack. Convoys would escort with jeeps and half-tracks bristling with the gun. Once doctrine embraced the gun as a general-purpose solution, its effects multiplied. It was not relegated to a single specialist unit. It became standard equipment across branches. Where doctrine spreads a technology, the enemy feels it everywhere. The M2 also benefited from a culture of maintenance and marksmanship. Crews trained to align barrels, to load belts properly, to choose the right mix of rounds for an expected target. Aircraft gunners practiced leading techniques until their muscle memory matched the math. Tank commanders practiced using turret-mounted M2s to pin infantry or to prevent enemy observation posts from functioning. The gun rewarded that proficiency with tangible results. Where German crews often improvised, Allied units often practiced until the responses became automatic. Finally, there is the intangible quality of simplicity. The Browning design required no exotic training to keep running. It was heavy, yes, but heavy in ways that helped it survive. It was not elegant in a laboratory sense, it was elegant in war. The Germans called it the smallest cannon because it behaved in combat like artillery at the scale of a machine gun. That label came with grudging respect. If a weapon forces you to change the way you move, to change the way you disperse, to change the way you sleep, then it has power far beyond its minute parts. When the 50 appeared in the sky or thudded from a Sherman roof, the math had already been done. The combination of energy, range, ammunition variety, reliability, mass production, and doctrine created a system that was more than the sum of its parts. It was a new element of the battlefield. It forced German soldiers to adapt not just tactics, but psychology. It demanded respect and created fear. The narrator's voice tightens and then softens. Understanding the gun is to understand why entire strategies shifted in the heat of battle. Up next, we follow the 50 from the air to the ground. We will see how pilots used it to become hunters, how tank crews used it to clear fields, and how infantry learned to survive under a rain of metal that changed the rules of engagement forever. The sky became a weapon, not by accident, but by design. Once the M2 found its place in aircraft, the air above battlefields ceased to be a refuge. Pilots who once strafed with light machine guns learned that weight and velocity mattered more than rate of fire. The M2 turned planes into moving batteries, and those batteries hunted with a new kind of precision. Picture a P-51 Mustang crossing a low coastal plain in the early morning. It carries 6 M2s under each wing and 2 in the nose. The sun outlines the gun muzzles like small black mouths. From the cockpit, the world opens in a precise geometry of targets. Troop columns look like tiny beads on a string. Trucks shine with the promise of fuel and ammunition. Each burst from the guns throws a ribbon of fire that arcs and finds its mark. The Mustang does not need to close to point-blank range. It can engage from a distance where return fire is mere buzzing noise. Pilots learn to watch tracers and to lead their targets by instinct. Where the Luftwaffe once feared only fighters and flak, now they feared a rain of heavy bullets that could rip apart wings and control cables in seconds. The P-47 Thunderbolt made the concept even more brutal. Built like a flying tank, it could carry 8 M2s and absorb damage that would have downed lighter fighters. Pilots in Thunderbolts came to relish low-level work. They dove into valleys, turned, and burned along river lines, and strafed supply dumps with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. For ground troops under attack, the result was immediate and devastating. Engines caught fire. Fuel drums detonated. Horse-drawn wagons disintegrated into splinters. A single well-timed pass could stop an advance for hours because no commander would risk moving men or vehicles through a corridor under such fire. The effect on German air doctrine was corrosive. Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf pilots were trained to rely on 20mm cannon and their own machine guns. Against Allied formations bristling with M2s, they found a new enemy. A Bf-109 or a FW-190 that survived an initial burst could still be fatally wounded by small structural failures. Control wires could be severed. Rudder or aileron hinges could be cut. The plane might still fly for a short while, but without usable control, it became a slow death trap. Reports from German squadrons repeatedly mentioned that survivability under heavy M2 attack fell sharply. Pilots learned to avoid coastal strafing and to keep altitude when possible. That was not always an option. Even more disturbing for the Luftwaffe was the way the M2 had multiplied in numbers. While a single 20mm cannon could be devastating, the Allies learned that many heavy bullets arriving together produced effects that were often equivalent to explosive shells. A formation of fighters concentrating fire on a bridge could create multiple punctures that would not only destroy the structure but also set lubricants and fuels alight. The Germans could not match that quantity at scale. Aircraft mounting 20mm cannon had to pay a performance penalty and carry less ammunition. Allied fighters could carry many M2s and thousands of rounds. In the arithmetic of air war, numbers mattered. The Browning's role in escorting heavy bombers changed the calculus of daylight raids. B-17s and B-24s began the war vulnerable to single-engine fighters. Their early defensive armament relied on a mixture of calibers. Through operational learning, the Allies shifted toward the 50 as the primary defensive caliber. The math was simple. A stream of heavy bullets could punch through the skin of attacking fighters and ignite engines while allowing bomber gunners to sustain longer passages of defensive fire without overheating. Bu-17 crews wrote home about the new pattern. The sound of multiple 50s firing from the waist and tail mounted positions became a comfort. It meant the crew had a fighting chance. The lethal combination of escort fighters armed with the M2 and the bombers that carried their own heavy guns created a layered air umbrella. German fighter pilots, who had once preyed on bombers with relative impunity, now found themselves facing coordinated fields of heavy machine gun fire. Losses mounted. The bomber streams that once seemed unstoppable began to exact a price on attackers that could not be ignored. In tactical terms, the M2 had inverted a long-held balance. Ground attack aircraft could now reliably make strafing runs, and defensive formations could survive longer against enemy fighters. The M2's influence reached into tactics that had little to do with shooting straight. Ground controllers began coordinating strikes in which fighters suppressed anti-aircraft batteries and then targeted support columns while medium bombers hit supply points. The weapon forced the Wehrmacht to scatter supplies, to move at night, and to use deceptive measures to hide convoys. Each adaptation cost time. Each adaptation reduced the Wehrmacht's ability to react swiftly. The American air machine, with its ubiquitous heavy guns, created friction the enemy could not easily remove. There were moments of stark drama. On a clear summer afternoon, a flight of thunderbolts attacked a train moving in a valley. The M2 rounds tore through the wooden cars, ignited coal, burst through water tanks, and then found the tender. The engineer had no time to react. Survivors later described how the heavy rounds punched holes into the boiler and sent scalding steam and metal fragments into the open. Railway traffic stopped for weeks in the region. It was not just the kill. It was the paralyzing effect on movement and logistics. German reports collected by intelligence services after the war included repeated references to a phrase that recurred like a phrase of dread. They called it a weapon that stripped the battlefield of its cover. Men sheltered in hedgerows had sandbags ripped away. Timber shelters were riddled through, and aircraft that once passed harmlessly overhead now became threats. The psychological impact was cumulative. When Allied ground forces advanced, escorted by fighters and supported by tanks with CO-located M2s, German commanders hesitated. Hesitation became opportunity. Pilots and gunners on the Allied side learned brutal lessons of their own. The M2 demanded discipline. Long strafing runs could attract flak and small arms fire that would rip a wing. Gunners had to balance aggression with timing and coordination. Yet when executed correctly, the effect was undeniable. An entire human and material network that once seemed secure from air attack became vulnerable to the combination of velocity, range, and volume that the M2 provided. By the time the war moved past Normandy, the idea that skies would remain friendly to movement had been shattered. The Germans adjusted. They camouflaged, moved at night, dispersed, and attempted to hide in the folds of the terrain. It helped in small pockets. It could not undo the new normal. The M2 had transformed the sky from a place of relative freedom into a domain of constant threat. Where it appeared, the balance of power shifted. Where it did not appear, armies still felt its absence. The narrator's voice slows. The M2 had become not simply a weapon of bullets, but an agent of operational change. It forced the enemy to think differently at every level. Up next, we step down from the sky into the black smoke of the road. We will hear how .50s mounted on Shermans and Jeeps tore apart convoys, and how infantry learned new ways to survive under a rain of metal that came without warning. By the summer of 1944, the sound of the .50 caliber had become as familiar on the ground as it was in the air. The war had come home to the earth, and the same weapon that tore through clouds now ruled the hedgerows, crossroads, and village streets of Europe. The M2 was mounted on everything that could move. Sherman tanks carried one on the turret ring, manned by the commander or loader. Half-tracks bristled with them, sometimes in twin mounts, sometimes in four-barreled meat chopper configurations that could fill an entire valley with overlapping arcs of fire. Jeep crews bolted them to roll bars and cargo racks, turning light reconnaissance vehicles into mobile gun platforms. In American hands, the 50 was not an accessory. It was an extension of doctrine, an answer to every problem the battlefield could offer. For the men who faced it, this created a kind of horror that defied classification. German infantry accustomed to rifle and mortar duels suddenly found themselves outmatched by a single gun that could reach them, pierce through their cover, and kill from distances where their own weapons could not reply. Machine gun nests, trenches, and even stone walls failed under sustained fire. Each round carried such energy that it pulverized brick and timber, sending splinters through anyone crouched behind. Even when not hit directly, men were injured by flying fragments of their own defenses. German field reports began describing encounters with American heavy machine guns firing explosive projectiles. They were not explosive at all, but to soldiers who saw sandbags burst into flame, it felt that way. In Normandy, an infantryman from the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division wrote in his diary, "The 50 tears through everything, helmets, walls, even the sides of our trucks. When it fires, you feel the ground tremble. It is not a machine gun. It is a punishment." American armored units quickly learned how to use this perception to their advantage. In close quarters, where tanks might hesitate to waste shells on small targets, the turret-mounted 50 became the perfect solution. Tank commanders used it to clear rooftops, to silence ambushes, and to keep enemy soldiers pinned behind walls until the main gun could finish them. Infantry advancing alongside tanks called it our guardian angel. It watched the flanks, suppressed snipers, and broke resistance before it began. German soldiers learned to identify its rhythm instantly. It fired slower than their MG-42s, but deeper. A heavy, percussive boom, boom, boom that echoed across valleys and villages. The distinctive flash of long tracers sweeping across the fields became a kind of warning. If you saw them, you were already in danger. Many veterans recalled that the only defense was to stay down and pray. When the 50 struck vehicles, the results were catastrophic. The armor on most German half-tracks was designed to resist rifle fire, not half-inch bullets moving at 900 meters per second. A single burst could perforate both sides of a vehicle, shredding men and equipment inside. Even the Panzer IV, once the backbone of German armor, was not immune. Shots from above or the side could penetrate vision slits, gun mantlets, and engine covers. The weapon was never meant to be an anti-tank gun, but in the chaos of war, it often became one. The Allies understood this too well. Convoy ambushes in France and Belgium turned into massacres once the 50s opened up. German trucks exploded in flames as fuel and ammunition cooked off. Anti-tank guns caught in the open were annihilated before they could unlimber. Survivors spoke of feeling the air itself vibrate under the continuous roar, as if the world had become one giant drum. By late 1944, entire German units were altering their defensive tactics to account for it. Foxholes were dug deeper. Machine gun crews positioned behind stone farmhouses instead of hedgerows. Even then, the results were grim. American gunners, guided by tracer streams, simply walked their fire across walls until they collapsed. What artillery could not hit fast enough, the 50 could erase in seconds. There are countless testimonies of its effect on morale. Captured German soldiers often expressed disbelief that the weapon was classified as a machine gun. To them, it was a cannon. A small, precise, and merciless cannon. Some even speculated that it violated the Geneva Convention, believing no mere small arm could inflict such wounds legally. It did not. It was simply more powerful than anything they had prepared to face. An infantryman from the 12th Volksgrenadier Division, taken prisoner near Aachen, summed it up in interrogation. "When the Americans fire the big gun on their tanks, we hide. When they fire the 50, we disappear." The weapon's presence changed the very way the Wehrmacht moved. Columns began traveling only at night. Patrols avoided open ground altogether. Even during offensives, commanders hesitated to advance without confirmed air cover, knowing that a single American convoy might carry enough 50 caliber guns to stop them cold. By the Battle of the Bulge, the M2 had become the most respected and most hated sound of the American arsenal. Its rhythm marked every counterattack, every retreat, every shattered road littered with burned-out vehicles and fallen men. German soldiers would later recall that even when they dreamed of home, they could still hear it in their sleep, the deep, rhythmic hammer of the weapon that never seemed to run out of ammunition. The narrator's tone drops to a measured calm. In the end, it was not just the bullet that made it terrifying. It was the knowledge that no matter where you stood, under the open sky or behind a wall, the 50 could still find you. It erased the illusion of safety, and that is why the fear lingered long after the fighting stopped. Up next, we follow that legacy into the war's final months, when even as Germany crumbled, the weapon that John Browning designed 3 decades earlier became the embodiment of Allied power itself. By the spring of 1945, the sound of the 50 caliber had become inseparable from the Allied advance. Across France, through the Ardennes, and into Germany itself, the weapon was everywhere. Mounted on tanks rolling through shattered cities, slung from jeeps escorting convoys, chattering from aircraft that swept low over columns retreating toward the Rhine. It was the voice of inevitability, the metallic punctuation mark at the end of every German defeat. In the ruins of Cologne, a single Sherman tank sits on a bombed-out street. Its gunner watches a bridge collapse in the distance while the commander scans the rooftops. Then, a flicker of movement, a sniper's glint from an upper window. Before artillery can be called or coordinates can be passed, the commander squeezes the trigger on the turret-mounted Browning. A dozen heavy rounds cut through brick and dust like paper. When the shooting stops, silence returns. The wall is gone. The sniper never fires again. It is a small, almost invisible moment, but it happens hundreds of times each day in hundreds of cities. The M2 has become a reflex, a natural extension of Allied muscle memory. For German soldiers, that same reflex meant paralysis. They no longer feared the unknown. They feared the familiar. They had learned the sound of the 50 too well. It followed them everywhere, in strafing runs that tore through retreating columns, in the slow grind of advancing armor, in the night patrols where even the smallest American convoy carried firepower beyond reason. It was not the largest weapon of the war, nor the most complex, but it was the one that refused to go away. When the fighting ended, the M2 remained. All across the liberated continent, Allied forces kept them mounted on guard posts, bridges, and checkpoints. German civilians passing through occupation zones came to recognize the heavy barrel and the blunt muzzle as symbols of authority. Even in peace, it was not silent. The thunder that once terrified armies now served as a warning against disorder, a reminder of the power that had won. The post-war years only confirmed what soldiers already knew. The Browning M2 was a masterpiece of balance. Heavy enough to last forever. Simple enough to repair anywhere. Powerful enough to make replacement unnecessary. American engineers tried to improve it. They built prototypes with quick change barrels, lighter receivers, modified feed systems. None could justify replacing the original. It had already achieved perfection of purpose. In captured German reports studied after the war, Allied intelligence officers found recurring references to the weapon's psychological impact. One Panzer Battalion after-action review described how strafing runs from P-47 Thunderbolts armed with 850s caused disorganization bordering on panic, even among veteran crews. Another from the 9th Panzer Division stated plainly, "Under heavy machine gun fire from aircraft, movement ceases entirely. Even armored vehicles cannot proceed. Morale collapses immediately." Those documents circulated quietly through post-war military academies. They became case studies in the relationship between technology and morale. The conclusion was always the same, that the true value of the 50 caliber was not only in its power to destroy, but in its power to control behavior. It shaped movement, dictated tactics, and defined fear. The weapon itself changed little in the decades that followed. From Korea's frozen hills to the jungles of Vietnam, from the deserts of Iraq to the mountains of Afghanistan, soldiers carried the same gun designed before their grandparents were born. It fought on aircraft, on tanks, on ships, and on tripods set in the sand. It never needed to evolve because it had been built at the perfect intersection of simplicity and power. The Germans, for all their engineering brilliance, never created a true equivalent. Their heavy machine guns remained complex, temperamental, or over-specialized. They built wonders of technology, the MG-42, the 88mm cannon, the jet fighter, but none combined universality with endurance like the M2. It was as if Browning had not designed a gun, but a concept, that a weapon could be both simple and absolute. In the museums of Europe today, the relics remain. An M2 mounted on the rusted hull of a Sherman in Normandy. Another, its barrel warped from years of firing, displayed beside the wreckage of a downed B-17. The steel has faded, but the design endures. Clean, functional, eternal. A weapon that outlived the war, the men who used it, and the world that made it necessary. The narrator's tone softens, reflective. In the end, the fear it inspired among German soldiers was not irrational. It was respect. Respect for a weapon that never failed, never faltered, and never stopped. They faced it in the desert, in the forests, in the cities, and in the skies, and they learned the same truth again and again. Power in war is not measured by complexity or size, but by reliability and reach. The M2 Browning had both. It began as an experiment in a Utah workshop. It became the heartbeat of Allied victory. And today, a century later, it still fires with the same rhythm, the same recoil, the same sound that once made German soldiers dive for cover and whisper, Der 50er kommt. The 50 is coming.